Welcome. Thanks for coming. I am Alan Carroll. I head the Story Maps team at Esri, and this is Bernd Zukowski, who you probably know. He's an institution, and I'm lucky to have him as a friend and colleague. And we are going to talk about story maps, tips and tricks. First, and here's how we're going to do it. Oops! Oh dear, that's no good.
Is it not up high enough?
I guess it's. I'll just do this.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Can I get it up close on your lapel there?
Let me hook it to my nostril.
He's got it there. He's got it. Is that right?
Oh, he's got
better?
it.
Thank you very much.
That's better? Okay, great. Sorry about that. So I'm going to first just briefly introduce story maps. Most of you are probably familiar with them, but just to be sure, I'll give you the basics. Then I'm going to turn it over to Bernd, and he's got a wonderful deck of with all sorts of practices and pitfalls with story maps. Then I'm going to take over again and show you a story map called 13 Ways to Make Your Story Map Sing, some of which will repeat some of what Bernd has pointed out, but I think these items, some of them do bear repetition. And then what's not on this list is I'm going to turn it back over to Bernd for some final thoughts and demos. And then hopefully we will have time, we'll make sure we have time at the end for questions and discussions. Everybody hearing me okay now? Good, okay. So what's a story map? And of course, this is a story map too. So I've pretty much forsaken PowerPoint except for that opening slide because I like story maps and they're a good alternative to making presentations. Here we go. We just need to sort of reload here. So story maps are web applications that combine interactive maps. These are maps that you've created perhaps on desktop and saved to ArcGIS Online, or maybe you've made them directly in ArcGIS Online, or perhaps you've discovered in the Living Atlas of the World or across this ecosystem that is ArcGIS Online, one of thousands and thousands of maps to use. But you can combine those maps, of course, with multimedia content. So your photos, your videos, occasionally audio, with text to tell stories about the world. And by world, I mean the world and everything and every place in it, from street corner to neighborhood to state to country to continent to planet. They work on a variety of screen sizes. So in other words, they're responsive. So your stories should look and work just as well on cell phones and tablets as they do on PCs. Now there are a few items like 3D web scenes that may not work on most cell phones, but our builder functions include an option to replace or have so-called alternate media. So you can, if you have a web scene in your story map, you can load an image of that web scene that will then show on a cell phone instead of that web scene. Most important to me is that story maps incorporate builder functions. So I am pretty much a technical dunce. I'm not completely worthless, but I do not know how to code. I'm not a developer by any stretch of the imagination, and yet I can create these sophisticated multimedia narratives without needing to know a line of code or anything about HTML or JavaScript or CSS or whatever. So basically, if you can make a PowerPoint, you can make a story map. Story maps are hosted by default by Esri in the cloud on ArcGIS Online, but they don't have to be. They're open source, so you can find our source code on GitHub or in our website, storymaps.arcgis.com, and you can download the source code, host it yourself, and that way you can get more detailed analytics on it, and you can also do a whole lot more customization if you are or if you work with developers who know that kind of stuff. Story maps support a variety of user experiences. So what we did early on was do a lot of experimentation. We'd assign ourselves stories, and sometimes a story would work as a one-off, but there were other times that we thought, gee, other people could pour their data into this story and it would work just as well. So that's what we then took and developed these builder experiences around. So our favorite, perhaps, is Story Map Cascade. You'll see examples of these in which the whole screen scrolls. It's very immersive, very versatile. kind of the father or mother of Cascade is Story Map Journal, and in this case, just part of the screen scrolls. So there's a side panel that scrolls. That side panel can contain text and images. As you go from section to section in the journal, what we call the main stage or the rest of the screen changes, and that might mean a multi-layer web map that with each section you might expose a different layer, or you might go from place to place on that map, or you might switch from a map to a video, or you might show a web scene, or you might show a still image, or you might even show another story map. There are lots of people doing story maps within story maps, sometimes to a fault, but occasionally it can be useful. Then there's Story Map Series, which is not unlike Journal, but instead of a continual scrolling experience, you can click from tab to tab. There are actually 3 layouts. You can also there's a bulleted version, and then there's a side accordion version that does more or less the same thing. And then Story Map Shortlist, unlike the others I've shown you, isn't a narrative, a sequential narrative. It's a curated set of points of interest. So you'll see a lot of short lists about different cities or parks or whatever, and you can organize that list of points of interest in a series of tabs or themes. And then finally, there's Story Map Tour, which is our first storytelling app that is simply a collection of geotagged photos and videos presented in narrative form. And by the way, we've got a new layout for Story Map Tour that forsakes the little carousel you see at the bottom, but also liberates the photo caption from the image itself and features the image better. We just like it because it's a clean and simple layout. So I don't recall right offhand if we have an example of that this afternoon, but we'll do our best to show you one. It's been a very exciting 7 years or so to watch the growth and to watch the booming popularity of story maps. To be above 500,000 story maps is kind of like a dream come true for me, but I feel like we're just at the start, and that there can and will and should be lots more story maps out there, hopefully with your help. So you can find us at storymaps.arcgis.com. I will probably give you a brief tour of the website at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bern.
All right, so what I've decided to do is I'm ad-libbing here, since this is the last time Alan will do this. And much to Alan's chagrin, I'm going to abandon a lot of my slides.
Oh my God.
Probably to your happiness, though. But I think it's just more fun to demonstrate than it is to have some slides up. So there are 2 workflows that you can use to build a story map. One workflow is what I consider the map-centric workflow, or the classic ArcGIS Online workflow, where you begin by authoring a map. And this is a really simple map that I've authored. It's just got 1 layer: New York City in 1836 from the David Rumsey collection, and this is the current world topographic base map. What could be simpler than that? Now, in the kind of map-focused workflow, what we do is we save the map. So I've saved this map, or I'll save it again now. And then we decide how we want to share it. And then once I do that, I can click this button to create a web application. And this is great. Hang on a second here. I'm going to show you another little trick here. I'll show you how to turn your organization apps back to their default, because I just finished a workshop on customizing that. So let me just do that real quick. So one of the cool things about an ArcGIS Online organization is that you can customize the configurable apps that you want to use. I want to use the Esri default, and now I've reset my organization, and apologies for doing that. So let's go back to my map. And there it is, New York City yesterday and today. And now when I go ahead and share this, and I click this button, I'll see the Esri default collection of configurable apps. And build a story map is one of the things I can do. So these are all the story maps, and they're here. This workflow I don't typically recommend, and it's because most story maps use more than 1 map. So I would typically recommend make all your maps, gather all your resources, your videos, your photographs, figure out how to store them, manage them, think about the story map you want to use, and then start them from the Story Maps website. But in this case, this is actually one that really works great in this this kind of mode. So here I've chosen Story Map Swipe and Spyglass, and I need to give it a new name. So I'm creating a new item, and I'll click Done. And what this does is this launches the builder experience for this story map. Now each story map has a unique builder experience because each story map is designed to tell stories in unique ways. But the builder just helps us go through that process. Default layout is vertical bar. I'll say yes. I've only got one layer in my map, and it's already figured out that that's the layer that I might want to swipe. Click Next. There's no description, no legend, no pop-ups. Let's open the app. So 3 clicks, something like that. I've gone ahead and I've created a great story map, which, hang on, which I forgot to, oh, I know what I did. This is classic here. This is what happens when you ad lib, right? So what I did was, I did something really foolish.
This happens to me every day.
It does, because I've been known to be very foolish. But what I did was I forgot to save my map with that layer on, I think.
Oh yeah, that's a little detail.
That is a little detail. So pardon me for catching up with a couple things here. So I'm going to go to, actually what I'm going to do is go to my groups, and I'm going to locate that map really quick. And it is in my workshop for the story map swipe and spyglass, which is right here. And here it is, New York City, yesterday and today. All right, great. So we're back to where we were a couple minutes ago. All right, so here's my map, and it's got this layer. And I'll turn that layer on. I'll remember to save it this time. I'll go ahead and share it, and I'll create that web app. Again, we're going to build a story map, and we're going to select Swipe and Spyglass. Let's create the web app. I'll call it App 2 this time, and then click Done. Again, it launches the builder experience for this. And we'll assume the default. It's already chosen this layer as a swipe type, or as a layer to swipe. We'll turn off these options and click Open the app. Fingers crossed, there we go. Ta-da. So now I've got a nice little story map swipe. It was that quick and easy. And from here, what I can do is I can go back into my settings, and I can choose a different swipe style. So let's select the spyglass, click Apply. It guides me through. It says, okay, my changes require a save and a refresh. So let's go ahead and save, and let's go ahead and refresh. And now, just a couple of clicks of a button, I have a different style to this. So it's really, really easy to create story maps, and the builders just guide us through the experience. That said, the way that we recommend that you build them is by going to the Story Maps website. And the reason is there's all sorts of resources here to help you get going. So there's some articles by Alan and team members, blogs, FAQs, things like that. There's a filter on the blogs. There's a gallery which you can browse and will get you inspired. There's featured, there's a story map of the month and things like that. These are some of Alan and his team's latest work, and they're really some remarkable things that you'll find here. But another thing that's really interesting is this thing called My Stories. And My Stories is a view into your content into your ArcGIS organization, and it kind of filters all the story maps. So here's the one I just built, and when I click on it, it opens it up and it makes sure that everything in there is up and running. So this one's pretty simple. It just has one map, but let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of other ones. I think one of these might be broke, I'm not sure. That one has got a bunch of images in it, so it's even checked those. And let's see here, this one might be broke. No, that one's good. You can see I'm the example of perfection. Story map creation. Okay, this one has got some issues. So you can see whenever it finds an issue, it highlights for us. In this case, my organization is set to HTTP secure, and some of the resources in there are HTTPS. And as a requirement then that my story map has to use all HTTPS content, and I didn't. So it gives some suggestions how to repair it, but it's a really good way for you to figure out what's going on with your story maps and keep them maintaining and up and running. So let's take a look at a couple of other interesting things you can do with the story map. Now, with the story map, I've just started a story map journal. I've just got a little title image here, and I've got a little section. What we can do, besides adding maps and things like that, is I can add other story maps to a story map. So let's try this. Here's a spyglass. You already saw how we built this. Let's go ahead and add a section, and let's title this spyglass option. And let's go ahead and add that. And the way I add another app to a story map is as a web page. So let's go ahead and configure. The position is almost always, the default one is correct. So the position is fill. And let's go to next. I need to add some text here, which I won't do in this case. And we'll go ahead and add it. So there's our story map inside of our story map journal. Now there's an improvement I can make. The journal gives us lots of place to add text. I really don't need this header up here. I don't really want these share links. I don't need the logo. There's already a logo on the housing journal. And really what I might want to do is just kind of minimize that header. So what I can do is go back to the main stage, and all I need to do is add ampersand embed. It's a little inline HTML configuration, and I just click configure and click save again, and now I've got a much better story map. This story map now doesn't have that title. It's nicely embedded inside the main stage here, and I don't have redundant text or things like that. So any story map will support that. So again, it's ampersand EMBED, ampersand embed at the end of the story map, and that just eliminates the header of the story map. There you go. So this is ready for embedding. There's also techniques that you can use to do this with other types of content. This is a web scene, and this is an interesting little web scene, but you can see there's all sorts of tools here that would distract the user from my story. A web scene is a little bit different. I add ampersand UI equal min, and this is all documented, so you'll find these in various blog posts. And what that does is that minimizes the user experience for the web scene. If I mouse over, I still get the little thumbnails for navigation, but I don't have the other tools, which might just be confusing to someone that's browsing my story. So that's how you can embed a scene and also other story maps. Now, this is a story map series, and it has a little bit of a header on top, and I can also minimize this by adding ampersand embed. So now we just have the tabs instead of that header. Now why is that of interest? Well, let's go to the Story Maps website, and we'll go to the gallery. And in this case, I'm looking for this app that I authored called Bats Under Threat. And this is a little story map about this disease that's killing bats by the millions in the United States. And I wanted to show certain things happen. One thing I wanted to show is the disease advancing over time. So I've got this little animation. Now the story map itself doesn't support animation, but there is an application called the Time Aware. It's a configurable application that if you add a map with a time-enabled layer, it allows you to create this little interface around it. So I took that application and added it. In the next section, what I did is I added another story map to this, which is the one that we just looked at. And again, the header is omitted, and it just lets us step through the species habitats and compare them to what's going on in the map. So there's just some little tips and tricks and some ways to get started. Again, we recommend that you start at the Story Maps website, get all your content in order, and start there. So let's take a look at some essential steps for success. First thing you need to do is think about your story before you dive in, and choose the right template. You might need to iterate through this. Lots of people get excited about a certain template, and then they struggle because they can't seem to get it to work right for the story they want to tell. So leave yourself open to the possibility that the template that you fell in love with may not be the best one to tell your story. So allow some flexibility. I like to prepare and optimize all my story components in advance. So my videos, my media, I prepare them, I optimize them, all my maps are done in advance. Build the story, then refine the story and simplify, and then repeat.
Now, That's not the only way to build a story. I tend to be kind of lazy and chaotic, and so I don't usually prepare and optimize most of the story components. I kind of add those as I go. So there's no one right way to do this.
And that is true. So there's lots of different paths to success, and each one will find their own. I'm a Virgo, so I tend to be a little more structured.
But regardless, by the way, to build a really good story, the iterations is essential. Sometimes dozens of hundreds of iterations, going back and refining and modifying and tweaking here and there.
Also, a good idea is to get fresh eyes to review. So there are things that you might like or be captivated by, which maybe someone else doesn't think is worth the time or is distracting. So get some fresh eyes to review. It's always a good idea to test on a variety of screen sizes. Understand what your target form factor is. Is it a device? Or is it a browser? Is it a 1080p resolution monitor, or is it something less? So it's a good idea to go ahead and experiment. A good idea also is to clear your browser cache. So sometimes you'll add an image that's too large. You won't notice it because it's cached in your browser. So clear your cache, try in different sizes and monitors and so forth. And then to ensure that story map components or the story map itself and any maps that they use are not deleted or changed, there's a setting in the items called delete protection, and that'll ensure that those things aren't removed. Now, a friend of mine who plays guitar says a guitar that won't stay in tune is a woofer. And we can look at these web maps and we can agree that these are woofers. They're not really good web maps. They're complicated. They're confusing. They use bad symbology. Bottom line is a great application starts with a great map. Great app starts with a great map, and the same is true for a story map. So poor or non-performant maps are the demise of many and otherwise great story maps, but there's lots of different ways that you can do this. Smart mapping is an easy way to guide you through some really nice styling. You need to think about performance as well. A lot of story maps don't use live maps. They actually use screen captures or graphics instead, and that's perfectly okay. You can use custom symbols to enhance what Esri provides. There's certainly a talent and a trade craft to this, and I encourage you to look at some of the maps done by Alan and his team to learn more about that. My pet peeve is unconfigured pop-ups, and I just think there's absolutely no excuse for these because pop-ups are so easy to configure, and there's no reason to put something called an object ID in front of someone that's viewing your story, or to shout at them with all caps items and things like that. So it's just too easy to make better pop-ups, and those are things that you should be doing as part of your basic map tradecraft. One thing I will mention here is that Arcade is an expression language. It's kind of like a little scripting language. And what that allows you to do is do some really cool things with pop-ups. You can do data conditional pop-ups. You can write a little expression that branches on the value of data in a field and change colors in your pop-ups or add different things to your pop-ups. And just keep that in the back of your mind. Arcade will be your friend when you're constructing amazing pop-ups. Another pitfall is poor legends. Here someone decided to add a legend to a map which just didn't have a legend. Here's another legend, which is, as you can see, pretty long. So not all layers need to be seen in the legend, and some of our best cartographers would argue a great map needs no legend at all because it speaks for itself. It's so obvious in the way that it does its cartography. So get rid of stuff that you don't need. Use some really good cartography. Maybe you really don't need one. And you can do things like make a mini version of your legend, maybe captured as a graphic, and use that in your story map instead, rather than use the legend from the web map. Another pitfall is too much information. I see this a lot because we all get excited about our stories and want to tell too much about them. So here's an example where someone has used the story map tour, and there's a whole big couple of paragraphs of text that people have to scroll through, and it's just really too much here. The solution is to use links. You can kind of outsource some of the information you want to include and just add a link. This is done just using a little bit of HTML, inline HTML in the description, and you can create links to other sources. You can even use this technique to make a subtitle in one of your story maps linked to other places. So a little handy trick there. Too much to say is this is actually a great story map. I really enjoy this, but if you look closely, it's got 101 sections. So I've never visited all 101 sections, but a friend of mine says, yeah, that was a great story map. Took me 2 nights to visit all those places, but I did, and I love them all. Here's an example of a story map series that you can see at the end of the series, everything kind of stacks up because there's too many verbose tabs across the top. So you can divide and conquer. You can actually embed story maps in other story maps and kind of break up your work and kind of divide and conquer and slim things down. It also may not be that essential to be sort of verbose in what you need to talk about. So some options there. Another pitfall is that your title is a great way to entice people into your story maps. Here's a couple of titles that don't get me excited about anything at all. But if I add some excitement and use the right words, even if it's a topic I'm not particularly excited about, I might be enticed to continue on the story to learn more. So a little bit of title craft is always good. By default, the Esri logo will be there, but it's your work, so why not add your own logo and links and give credit where credit is due. So make sure you do that. Another pitfall is that images in your story map aren't optimized for display. This was actually a winner of one of our first contests, and what I've done is I've captured a screenshot with fresh browser cache as this big image slowly painted onto the main stage. So obviously they didn't test it with fresh browser cache. But the best way to avoid this right now is story maps now, if you add local images, will automatically optimize and resize it for where they're being used in the story maps. You don't even need to think about that if you just load your images from local files. Story map takes care of that, and it embeds it in the story map so they're always there. If you're using Flickr and you put things out on Flickr, Flickr stores images at different resolutions, and the builder is smart enough to know which resolution image to fetch. Otherwise, if you're hosting on your own servers or somewhere else, Box, Google Docs, or somewhere like that, you need to optimize the images for where they're going to be used in your story.
And there's info on that sort of thing in our blogs, etc.
I showed you already some examples of embedding, but you can kind of overdo it. And this is one I don't. Alan likes this one. I don't. But it's a matter of taste. Vanilla versus chocolate. I'm definitely a vanilla kind of guy. But here's a story map journal that's embedded a story map series with the side accordion layout on the right side. And I don't know. I think this is. I don't know, it just doesn't get me. But it's also, on the other hand, a great way to present additional information about this topic in this one section of journal. So it's up to you and really up to your audience, and at some level just simply a matter of taste. Here's an example of an embedded story map where they included the header. You can see there's lots of space on the left-hand side for all that text, and you don't really need to have that header. So again, use ampersand embed. This is that wonderful looking map, and it's actually an app that's been embedded here. And again, this kind of detracts from this story. You want this map to complement your story, not to be an application that someone is going to use and forget about the story that you want to tell them. So there's different techniques you can use there. Minimize the header, only embed when it adds to your story. And if you really want to embed a web map with a few tools, there's the minimalist configurable application, which doesn't have a header and just has a few tools that you can leave in or out. And that's a great way to embed additional story maps. Another pitfall is we see lots of story maps embedded into websites that just don't give them enough room to breathe. They're just kind of stuffed in there, and they're really compact. And sometimes the story map needs a little extra room to breathe. They are responsive, so they fit different form factors, but it's not the best experience in the web page when they're too scrunched. So what you can do is add a view larger link, which will open it up so that it'll open up in a new browser or tabs, so that someone can experience the full story maps. And in the future, we're going to have a share bar. Actually, it's implemented now. When you create a new story map and embed it, it'll have a little share bar at the bottom, which will enable it to open up in full resolution. So we've kind of managed that problem for you. In the side panel of many story maps, you can add photographs. If it's an interesting photograph or something with text, don't forget to add that view larger link button so that someone can open it up and take a look at it and see it in all its glory. Another thing that you might want to consider is, this was another winner. It's a great story map, but when it opened up on my monitor, it showed a lot of white background here because the map itself wasn't zoomed in so that it would ensure that it was filling the full screen here. So I found that a bit distracting and took off a few points for this. But again, you can do that by understanding your target form factor, target size, and then zooming in a bit on the map in this case to make it fit. So just try things out on different monitors and just check your results. A big stop sign is when you've used content that isn't publicly shared inside of your story map that is public. Then that's the big stop sign for a user. When they reach that, they hit this, sign in place. But if you use My Stories, that's probably the greatest tool ever built for story map authors. That will look at your story maps and help you look for things that you need to correct there. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Alan.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to, again, there will be a little bit of repetition in here, but I hope these various forms of advice will be useful to you. So number 1 of 13 is make sure it works. It just sounds so basic, but it's pretty embarrassing to publish a story and then tell your boss, I've got this great new story map. I did this early on in our tenure. I sent a story map to Jack that he couldn't view, and that's not cool. And that's before My Stories existed. So do check My Stories. Also, you might see that might have already noticed that little buttons appear at the top of stories you've authored. One is an edit button. Only you see that, so that allows you to go straight into the builder. And the second is health checker from My Stories, and that turns orange or red if there's an issue with your story. So keep an eye out for that. And for published stories, it doesn't hurt to go back now and then to make sure that your story remains healthy. Number 2 is start with a bang. As much as I love maps, I find it's usually better to start a story with something other than a map. To find a really nice image or video that kind of grabs people is really good, and also to come up with a headline that's evocative. So the Uprooted sounded better to me than the ongoing refugee crisis or something like that. We worked with the UN refugee office on this story, and they gave us access to their photo archives, and in it was a B-roll, what they call B-roll, which is something you can use behind a voiceover or something. And this was actually a slow motion video of these people traipsing down a field, and the instant I saw that, I said, aha, we've got it, because it just makes it so evocative, and it really grabs you, much more than, say, a map would. Here's another example. Dan Coe, who won last year's Storytelling with Maps contest with this story. This is a looping video, so it evokes the floods. It's also the one Cascade story that I know of that actually opens with a real cascade, which is just kind of cool. Number 3 is configure pop-ups, and Bern talked about this, but I can't tell you how many times our hearts have been broken, or we've been crestfallen to find an otherwise beautifully polished story map, and then you click and you see this kind of GIS-y gobbledygook. There are many ways you can configure, as Bern said, your pop-ups to do interesting things. And the place to find that is within the ArcGIS Online Map Viewer. There's that little configure pop-up thing, and within that it gives you several options. You can do pretty neat stuff, including this, which is you can create text and have parts of a sentence be filled by an attribute. So in this case, any county you click on, you'd see the county name, and then you'd see the percentage based on the attribute data, which is pretty sweet. Number 4 is tweak your legends. As Bern said, we strive to not have legends at all in various ways by keeping our maps really simple, designing our cartography to be hopefully as intuitive as our builders are. The defaults can be really pretty excruciating. There are several ways you can simplify legends. One is another item in the ArcGIS Online map viewer is this ability to hide a certain layer in the legend. You can turn off layers that just don't matter or don't make sense. You can rename layers to get rid of all those awful underscores and things. Or you can get more radical and you can decide not to use a legend at all, and in a desktop graphics program create a sort of custom legend that you can then save as an image and add the image, in this case, to the side panel of the map journal. And then one way to not have a legend at all is to turn a key part of the text, the color of that item on the map. And so this way, I guess this really is a legend, but it's integrated right into the text and feels, you're not asking the user to make another step and move over to another element to figure out what's going on in the map. Number 5 is consider static maps. Now, there are some story maps that just need dynamic maps. This wouldn't be much fun at all if it didn't enable people to explore. So for some strange reason, we decided to publish a story that located every single outlet of the 10 most popular fast food stores or restaurants in the country. And of course, it's fun to zoom into your city and find your favorite Subway or Starbucks or Pizza Hut or whatever. But a lot of maps, the interactivity isn't essential, isn't necessary at all. So for this story on the displacement of Japanese Americans during World War II to these detention camps, my talented colleague Cooper Thomas created maps that did exactly what we wanted them to do. And so there was no reason to interact. There was no added value to interacting. And so it's in fact, if you go to websites like the New York Times, you might have noticed that they do a lot less with interactive maps. Very broad audiences, they find most of them just never bothered to interact. They didn't. Oops, sorry about this. They didn't. So they said, well, let's just make our maps work as is rather than making them interactive. Now, for our audiences, if our audience is GIS users, they're more used to interactive maps. So it does kind of depend on the circumstance, the type of story, and who you're serving up the story to. Testing different screen sizes, as Bern mentioned, is really key as you're building a story. Sometimes it can be a little tricky with zoom levels of maps. It might look good in one screen size, and then you resize your browser window and it doesn't look good. So sometimes you have to do some trial and error to make sure things work. Also, for photos, to make sure that photos work on cell phones. One of the cool things within our Cascade app that you can use is that there's a little control in the builder that sometimes the photo is inevitably going to get cropped if a person holds a cell phone vertically, but you can drag a sort of center, a little spot around the photo to ensure that the essential part of the photo is going to appear even on that mobile view. Bern talked about embedding, and here's how you can do that. How you can preview and refine embed window sizes, and it's a little obscure, which is why I bring it up here. So in my stories, there's this little link button. If you click that, then you can test and preview different embed sizes. So there's some standard ones, but you can also type in pixel widths and heights, and then click preview your embed, and it launches a sort of fake web page with your story within it, which is really neat. The big problem with small embeds is that with some of our story maps, it can then load the mobile version of the story, which is just doesn't look right or cool within the context of a larger web page. Another thing I'd like to think a lot about as a kind of designer and editorial viewpoint as I'm building a story is to create a little world. So I try to style my maps and style the infographics within a story and choose the color scheme within the story map to all match. And it's these little details that can really make a story map sing. So in this case, the Amazon conservation team, which has done a bunch of really neat story maps, chose to this is a black and white photo, but they chose to give it a sepia tone. They did a little customization to add a sort of textured background to the side panel, and they chose one of several color schemes that are available for story map series to all evoke a sort of period look. They even customized the buttons within the story map and used the same typeface as this custom title for the story. So these are things that might require some of the HTML that I said you didn't need, but you can take these extra steps and do some customization to create these little worlds. Second one is to invite people to your story, and by that I don't necessarily mean invite people to look at your story, but to do your best to populate your story with people. I love maps, obviously, but maps can tend to be a little cold and clinical and distant and impersonal. And the really powerful thing to me about story maps is that you can combine maps with multimedia content to bring your maps to life and to tell a story that can really grab people in a visceral way. So the City of Bellingham Home Fund could have done a story that was all about this kind of stuff, but they were smart enough to integrate with the maps that showed things like low-income rental units with pictures of homeless people. And then you suddenly think, you know, get there, but for the grace of God, go I. You know, that's a family that could be my family. And suddenly it just brings this issue that might seem a little kind of distant and abstract to life and gives it emotional impact. Think big and small. By that I mean I like to use the power of interactive maps and story maps to provide a kind of small-scale overview of things, but then literally or figuratively kind of zoom in to show things in more detail. So this story we did on the cost of beef, the kind of environmental cost of beef, we worked with the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment that had these amazing series of global maps showing things like the average calorie yield of agricultural lands around the world. So those provided an overview, but then we wanted to zoom in to the big fields and the rectangular surveys of the American Midwest where so much of the corn and soybeans are grown that go to feed cattle instead of people, which is the source of a lot of the waste. But we also wanted to give a sense of the huge scale of the beef industry by showing this one of actually two great big plants in I'm forgetting the town now. Dodge City, Kansas, of course, traditionally the railhead for cattle, the cattle business, and show the industrial scale of these slaughterhouses. Next is to dare to be simple, and that applies to your cartography. Byrne demoed, obviously, the spyglass story. It's just dead simple. But this story went viral. So a bit of a story behind the story. We used to have a deal with the Smithsonian that we prepare a story map every month for the Smithsonian. And sometimes we went to considerable lengths to do custom stories. And it was summertime and much of the team was going on vacation. So I was thinking, what can we do that's really simple? So we created these little spyglasses for a half dozen US cities. Well, guess what? This was the most popular of all our Smithsonian maps, so with the possible exception of a story on the Battle of Gettysburg. But this, especially the New York one, went viral. But it was super simple, but it was just really, really fun and cool for people to be able to peer through modern New York to see 19th century New York. Another perennially popular story that's still on, I think, our top 50 most popular list is this story on the age of megacities. And so we just went from city to city using our urban observatory maps, and people could click to see the growth of the city over time. And this is still used very often in classrooms and is just generally popular elsewhere. So simple approaches can be often your most effective ones. Next, dance to the rhythm. Just like I like to change scales, I like to create a sort of cadence or rhythm within a story. A simple example here is another story by Dan Coe, the guy who did that Cascade one. He created on his spare time excuse me, this essentially interactive guide to the trees of the Pacific Northwest. And so each species, you saw a really nice photograph, and you could click to find the range map, also really nicely formatted. You can see how he's created this little world by making the color of the link the same as the color of the range map. So after one or two trees, you realize, oh, okay, they're all going to be like this. He also created a kind of table of contents that you could zoom back up to find specific trees. You can also apply this rhythm to a series of story maps. So in this case, the Natural Resources Conservation Service created and continues to create a weekly story called Fridays on the Farm, and they aggregate those stories into a short list, another one of our apps, so people can find all the stories on the short list. They can click on an item in the short list, and from there they can go to a specific story that they've beautifully formatted in a very consistent way. They've added branding to their cover images. They use this hashtag Fridays on the Farm consistently throughout the series, and of course they socialize the series via Twitter, etc. A great program. Really important to anything that's related to a cause is to add a call to action to your story. So if you're going to get people excited and inspired or concerned about an issue, you want to end your story with a big a donate button or a link to become a member of that organization or to volunteer, or you name it. So here's another example. That same uprooted story I told you about refugee crisis, we added a concluding section with links to humanitarian organizations and the UN Refugee Agency for people to donate. And then finally, for those of you who do have perhaps a greater aptitude than I do, and that you want to go in and do some additional customization, as I said, it's entirely possible to download the source code and go into the code and do all sorts of customizations. We have a Developers Corner blog that is specifically for that and presents all sorts of ideas for how to add things like index maps, how to add custom backgrounds and color schemes, how to change fonts, all sorts of things that you can do to further enhance your story map. And here's an example of Halo Trust added custom color scheme. Here's an example of an index map to a story that we published. This works like a table of contents, so to click here, it would take me straight to that item in the story. So those are 13 ideas that I hope you might find useful. And now I'm going to turn it back to Bern.
All right, so I'm going to go over just a couple of those things. The cost of beef is actually one of my favorite ones, and I think what this demonstrates is that besides a great photograph, besides some great maps that are in here, it's also about just some interesting graphics that help you tell the story. So graphics like this that help us understand the point that we're trying to make in the story.
By the way, after we published this story, our head of sales gave me a call and said, by the way, the American Cattlemen's Association is $1 million client of Esri, and maybe we shouldn't be exposing the evils of beef, so mea culpa.
But so be it.
So be it. And I think they're still a client. I don't think we've lost the account.
So it doesn't have a lot of maps, but the maps that are in here are really performant. So you can see the maps are kind of placed in here where appropriate, and they perform super, super well. So when you are using a map, make sure it effectively helps tell your story and that it performs really, really well. And there's some interesting ones throughout here, including just kind of captures of imagery. This one we can explore a little bit and learn about cattle feedlots and so forth. Anyway, a really interesting one. This is the other one that Alan mentioned, the guide to the trees. I really like this one. I'm actually a biologist, a failed biologist because I'm here at Esri, but that's what I was, and I studied trees, and this is really cool. It uses something called actions. to enable us to jump to a different part of the story. So this is meant as an index to these different trees. So here's the Pacific Madrone, which happens to be one of my favorite trees, and it's got some really compelling photographs. And
These are all his photographs, by the way. It's pretty amazing.
I can click on the map, or I can click on the link here, and it'll open up a map, perhaps. Internet be with us. There we go. And it's got a little overview and things like that. So again, really nice use of color. And for each of these, after we view some things about the tree, I can go back to the list of trees, and I can look at other types of trees using this kind of index to all those trees. So really nice and interesting technique. Earlier when we talked about embedding, we discussed some of the ways that you can embed things. I like consistency, actually. This is a story map series, tabbed layout, and this is really good house for other story maps. And in this case, telling a story about sea level rise, all of these tabs have an embedded story map journal. So it's consistent. So each tab I click has the same user experience, and I'm not being kind of jarred or jogged into a different user experience. And all the story map journals are kind of short and sweet. This uses a technique that has been blogged about on the developer and on
Developers
Medium,
Corner.
Developers
Yep.
Corner, like how to style these different buttons, and these again are actions which drive something to happen on the map. So again, clever use there. This is another story map series, and in this case it embeds cascades. This is another pattern that I like. So each of these tabs has an embedded story map cascade that helps tell the story of sustainable forests in the Pacific Northwest. While we like to think of story maps as a great way to tell stories, some of our different industries, some of our different practitioners are adopting it as sort of like a binder or a catalog for other applications. So this is something that we worked on during our Hurricane Irma and Harvey response. This is a story map series. This is the side accordion layout, and in this case it's not meant so much to tell a story but to be a catalog of resources that were used during the response effort. So here's the NOAA imagery viewer, the application. You know, I've already kind of expressed that this is one of the pitfalls, too much going on here, but again, this is meant to be an index, a catalog. I can view the item details from here, and I can also open it in full screen, and the intent of this story was to let people look at it in full screen and then bookmark the applications that they wanted to use. So that's kind of a binder approach. These days, story maps are used a lot for presentations, as Alan did, as a lot of people on the stage did. This was one that I used actually 5 years ago, actually 4 years ago. And the reason why this works is because I'm using PowerPoint slides, and I wanted to do a demonstration. I didn't want to exit PowerPoint and then go to a live web map, but this allows me to move right from a PowerPoint slide to a web map, do a little bit of a demonstration, back to a PowerPoint slide, and then back to a live application. So you don't have that, that jarring exiting PowerPoint and then entering into something else. Story maps are used a lot for instructions, and they're used a lot by Esri staff to help people along with our technology. So this is a story map by Lisa Berry about how to use smart mapping, and it kind of guides us through the process step by step, and every now and then you'll see a little animated GIF which has been placed in there which shows us something. So good use of things. Story maps are used for all sorts of things. Here's a story map cascade that is embedded into this Rotary International website, and this is actually their annual report. So that's an interesting use of story maps. It's got a few maps in here, but it's an annual report. This is another example of a great story map by John Nelson, who's a really clever and a witty cartographer. And a lot of his story maps don't have live maps at all. And it just shows you that you can use maps that aren't necessarily live.
There's kind of the illusion of interactivity because it changes as you scroll, but they're all static maps.
Yeah, so he's using the transitions in the story map cascade to create these really interesting effects. So it's a very, very effective that way, and just a beautiful story. And let's see, finally, I think this will be the second to the last one. This is one of my favorite story maps because I like photography. That's the only map or anything close to a map you'll see is this little graphic here. All the rest are these really amazing photographs which help tell the story about coral reefs in Palau here. So
A dirty little secret is most of our apps you can create a story map with no maps, but we kind of like maps, but it is possible.
And this is also embedded in their website, so this is part of their website. And finally, let's go back to the Story Maps website, and we'll look at one of Alan's latest productions. He's evolving a series on the age of humans. Age of the Anthropocene is what we're living in, and this is a story about the human reach. Again, this starts off with a compelling graphic, and also some really, this is a nice little build here, which tells a story about the increasing population of the planet and kind of brings that forward in the future. What Alan and Cooper have also done is they've added some really nice little animations, some nice little videos which help tell the story.
This was created in ArcGIS Pro. You can do these kinds of animations, and then we essentially saved it as a video and uploaded it to Vimeo and embedded it in the story.
And after each of these is actually the actual scene. Scenes take just a second or two longer to kind of come into focus here to crisp up. But again, these are the web scenes that are being used in here and really nicely done in terms of positioning and the flyby text. And maybe we'll end with this. This is just interesting. So this is the human footprint, again built using ArcGIS Pro. And you'll notice that the orientation of the Earth is not as we would normally anticipate.
Some people don't like that, but I say it provides a fresh perspective on the world. So I think it's really cool.
So bottom line is, story maps are really easy to make.
And fun.
And fun. And with a little bit of creativity and with thinking a little bit about best practices, you can just make some awesome story maps, whether it's about where tax dollars are being spent in your city, or whether you're trying to get somebody excited about activism in a certain area. Whatever your story is, there's lots of ways to tell them using story maps, right?
That's it. That's right. Thank you so much. We have a...
Questions, anybody?
Thanks. Yeah. We have a few minutes for questions if you have any. There's one.
When you embedded that story map within the NGO's website, so it looked like part of that NGO.
Uh-huh.
How do you go about doing something like that? Like it didn't say everything's story maps in the URL, it said like that NGO's.
So that's they embedded in their website, and they just made it full screen so that their navigation their navigation bar remains there, and their I think the same footer even remains there, but it's
To embed that is on the website side?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Story map side?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they're using an iframe here to embed the story map.
Right.
Very simple to do, and you can do this with any story map. Yes, sir.
Am I correct in understanding that it's impossible to have this without the cloud? So that if I wanted to make this in sort of a deliverable, I can't
Well, it's like,
access to a cloud to access the resource.
yes, you need to be on, the question is, this needs to be online, I need to be online to experience this, and the answer is yes, with a little bit of an asterisk after that. We are looking at ways of leveraging some of the offline capabilities that are in ArcGIS to make offline story maps. However, this is like a website. You wouldn't expect a website to work offline, right? So this is live stuff. Oftentimes you're leveraging live data in your map, so it does require an internet connection. But we are looking at things. Do you have any addition?
Yeah, nothing short term. That's a big undertaking to create, to really enable offline interactive story maps. We do have a print function for a couple of our apps. For the Journal and Cascade app, you can save as a PDF, which you can then print. But of course, that's a very different experience than a fully interactive story map.
And while I'm looking at this, by the way, I'm thinking this is a Vimeo video. So a little tip is you can take a very small video clip, and if you add it to Vimeo and then add that to your story map Cascade, it automatically loops. So we've got it set to automatically loop when you add it in to the title sheet of a story map Cascade.
There's a question back there?
If I'm building a story map within Portal, can I link to other applications? I.e., I want to teach a class on SAP. Can I link to an SAP instance and still maintain that integrity of the story map?
Yes, and I'm going to say that I don't know how SAP is being used, but if you can access it via an iframe, like an embed HTML, or access it via a URL within your organization. You can add anything to a story map. You just add it as a web page.
Yes.
We're watching them talk up there, but we can't hear what you're saying. Is there audio in a story map?
There can be. By default, what we do, just because it tends to be annoying, is the audio is turned off, but on some of these story maps, you'll actually see a little kind of a mute button there, so you could turn them on. And there are ways to include even audio clips. We've done some blogs on adding audio clips to story map tours and things like that. So you can do that.
So another question, when you were doing that time lapse instead of animation, you had a time lapse and you were explaining that. Can you put your voice into that and explain that?
You could, as an audio clip, you could add that to the story map. It would be difficult to sync it with like a scroll or something like that, but you could add like a little play button, you know, play audio to learn more or something like that.
That's one thing I've been wanting our team to experiment with. We just haven't gotten around to it yet. But to try an actual narrated story map would be an interesting experiment. Over here?
I have so we do a sync brief every morning and have a web map that's updated with the activity over the last 24 hours.
Yep.
And on the left hand in the text panels, our nighttime staff in our fusion desk actually manually go in there and cut and paste from the initial incident reports and put whether the incident is growing, whether
Right.
it's steady state. And we want to be able to bring that dynamically from the map to be able to, count those yellow points, count the green ones, count the red ones, and populate that number in the text side.
In the text side. Yeah, that's not a current capability. It's a cool idea, and I'm sure I would assume it's doable via customization and custom programming, but yeah, that's a neat thought. There are all sorts of ideas afloat, especially with our compadres in the hub group, about not only having these generic templates, but let's just say there's a city has an initiative, and they're working on creating essentially prepackaged story maps. So it might have the information for one city, but another city could just plug their own stuff into each component. So it's a little akin to what you're talking about.
But I could use generator, right? The get of the generator capability, right, for story map.
I think so. Again, I'm a technical dummy, so but my colleagues downstairs on the exhibition floor could answer that for you.
So somebody real quickly, wanted to ask about audio. This is one of the ones from our gallery, and this is a story map tour, but they've added a little audio clip here, so that this thing, if I turn on my audio, will go
Old
ahead.
City Hall. This iconic 1892 building was originally the City Hall for New Watcom, a municipality created...
Right, so you get the idea. You can do those things right now with an off-the-shelf story map.
Yes.
You're on a Mac and he's on a Dell. Does it matter?
No, because this is all web-based. So yeah, all you need. And now, if you're creating a map on desktop, then that situation changes. But everything is web-based, so I can happily stay addicted to my Macintosh.
And these are all responsive, so as I shrink down the form factor, this is a story map tour. It just assumes a different form factor, but it's the same exact tour. And if I expand it out, then I get kind of the full browser experience.
By the way, one story in terms of audio, we decided as a holiday thing a couple of years ago to do a story map called The 12 Places of Christmas. So I went and found for things like ladies dancing and pipers piping, I found place names that were closely akin in terms of the name of the place to that part of the Christmas Carol, and we sang the Christmas Carol. And Lee Bach, here we go. Lee Bach, the developer of this, came up with a good idea. Instead of a mute button, he had the button say "Make it stop,"
Make it stop.
because our rendition wasn't very good. So we have fun on our team. We also have great fun, and it's enormously gratifying to turn it off, make it stop. It's hugely gratifying to discover the kinds of story maps that people like you are making. So we hope to discover your great stories in the future. Thank you so much. I think we're out of time.